Okay, imagine this scene for a moment. You wake up, and there's this soft chime of crystal, maybe the scrape of silver spoons on porcelain.
Mm,
You can almost smell the sort of dry dustiness of silk gowns moving across marble floors, and this really overpowering, almost cloying sweetness from hundreds of perfume sachets.
right, the scent of extreme luxury.
Exactly. But then underneath all that grandeur, there's this other smell, something heavy and sick, visceral. It kind of makes your stomach clench.
Mm.
You see these courtiers, perfectly dressed, bowing really low before this magnificent figure, elaborate wig, gleaming coat.
Mm.
But if you look closely, a lot of them are pressing these heavily scented handkerchiefs to their faces, trying to breathe through their mouths.
Wow.
This is September 1715.
Hmm.
And you're watching Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, basically rotting alive, slowly and agonizingly, right there in front of his entire court.
It really is the ultimate sensory contrast, isn't it? That spectacle of absolute power right up against the, well, the inescapable, humiliating horror of just mortal decay. The silver and the silk trying desperately to hide the sickness. That exact juxtaposition, that's the territory we're really digging into today.
That's exactly right. Our mission in this deep dive is to pull back the curtain on two really radically different historical systems, but expose a kind of shared truth about systemic performance and ultimately failure.
Right.
So on one side, you've got the absolute peak of European absolute monarchy, the ultimate gilded cage of Versailles,
Mm-hmm.
and on the other, the dense fog, the crushing vulnerability of Victorian London's poorest streets.
These two worlds, they seem completely opposite, don't they? One built on gold and, well, seemingly infinite power, the other on just sheer desperation and zero power.
Totally.
Yet, what our sources show is that both systems demanded this brutal, constant, all-consuming performance from the people trapped inside them.
How so?
Well, Louis XIV, he had to perform this kind of divine physical perfection just to keep his political control,
Yeah.
even as his own body was literally disintegrating. And then the marginalized people in Victorian London, they had to perform invisibility, silence, just to survive this commercial engine of exploitation that actually relied on their misery.
So we're examining the hidden cost of keeping up those illusions. Case one, Louis XIV's physical and political collapse, masked completely by the amazing stagecraft of Versailles.
Mm-hmm.
And case two, the systemic social and economic decay that women in Victorian prostitution suffered, hidden behind this thin but really deadly veneer of Victorian moral outrage.
And this brings us to the central question for you listening. What happens when a system, whether it's designed to glorify a king or, moralize a society, becomes so rigid, so demanding that it completely fails to acknowledge the fundamental humanity of the people caught within it?
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the very top. The dazzling yet, well, decaying world of the Sun King. The story starts almost like a myth, doesn't it? Louis was born Louis Dieudonné God-given in 1638. And this was after, 23 years of his parents' childless marriage?
Yeah.
Miraculous, almost.
Absolutely. So from the very beginning, his life wasn't just his own. It belonged to the state. He was positioned as this divine gift, destined for glory.
But that destiny got a serious reality check very, very quickly.
Right.
With profound political terror, actually.
That's right. When his father died in 1643, Louis was just 4 years old. He becomes king, but the real power, of course, is with his mother, the Regent Anne of Austria, and the chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin.
And the French nobility were not having it.
Not at all. They refused to accept this arrangement, and that plunged the nation into this series of civil wars known as the Fronde.
And this wasn't just like political infighting far away. This was formative, visceral terror for the young king himself.
Oh, absolutely. The sources describe these rebellions as so severe, the royal family was repeatedly forced to flee Paris, often in the middle of the night, barely escaping capture by these insurgent nobles.
It sounds terrifying for a child.
And there's this one anecdote that just perfectly captures the psychological damage. Louis was barely 10 years old, and rebels hostile to Mazarin broke into the Palais Royal. Wow. He recounts having to lie perfectly still in his bed, pretending to be asleep, while these armed rebels searched his bedroom just to make sure he hadn't escaped.
I can't even imagine.
That memory, that feeling of complete powerlessness, of being physically vulnerable to men who were supposed to serve him, it carved this mandate deep into his psyche. He would never be vulnerable again. Never.
And that need for absolute, unchallenged control, you can see it directly shaping his actions later on.
Definitely. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis is 22. Now, physically, he's actually quite slight, maybe 5'4", but described as extremely athletic, graceful, all that dancing and hunting.
Right, the ballet.
Exactly. Handsome, dark eyes projected this immediate charisma. But instead of appointing a new chief minister, which was the tradition, he shocks everyone, declares he will govern entirely alone.
Which was revolutionary at the time.
Completely. And it stemmed directly from that humiliation, that terror of the Fronde. He realized if he shared power, he invited dissent. The moment he took personal control, the whole Sun King persona was fully activated. It was designed to project an authority so complete it felt, well, beyond human challenge.
And the main tool for maintaining that unchallengeable authority wasn't just armies or laws. It was this incredibly complex system of architectural and social manipulation, all centered at Versailles.
Ah, Versailles, yes. When he permanently moved the court there in 1682, it was designed as the ultimate gilded cage. A physical manifestation of his power, sure, but much more importantly, it was a trap for the nobility.
How so? A trap?
Well, every significant French noble was basically required to spend part of the year there, competing desperately for his attention, all within its walls. They were forced to leave their own ancestral lands, their political power bases back home. It rendered them politically impotent, while they were reduced to just, squabbling courtiers fighting over scraps of favor.
And the etiquette system there was just mind-boggling in its detail. It was performance art turned into statecraft.
Totally. The famous lever, the king's ceremonial waking and dressing. You had grown dukes and princes viciously lobbying for the immense honor of handing the king a specific piece of clothing, his shirt, his coat, even his royal breeches.
It sounds absurd.
It sounds absurd, but it wasn't just a fun ceremony. That honor was directly tied to political power, to economic subsidies. If you were allowed to witness the lever, you were close to the source of power. If you were excluded, your political life just withered on the vine.
Even going to bed was part of it.
Oh, yeah. His nightly ritual of going to sleep, the coucher ceremony, was another formalized opportunity for nobles to gain or lose status. Louis literally weaponized proximity. Who got to be near him, when, and for what purpose?
And what's so crucial here, as you hinted at earlier, is that while the public performance was all about this unimaginable opulence, the reality of actually living inside that system, it was horrific.
Oh, deeply. We picture Versailles as pristine, maybe, but our sources paint this picture of profound physical decay hidden just behind the gold plating.
Like what?
Well, it was basically a stinking monument to control. You had thousands of people, nobles, servants, petitioners, all crammed into apartments. And the farther you were from the king's own chambers, the smaller and more squalid your quarters became.
Right.
The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, competing expensive perfumes, desperately trying to mask this pervasive stench of decay-rotting food just left in hallways, and the notorious sanitation crisis.
Ah, yes, the sanitation. It's staggering when you read about it. Not enough chamber pots, servants couldn't empty them fast enough.
Which often resulted in courtiers, even powerful nobles, simply relieving themselves in hallways, on staircases, behind curtains, rather than face the public humiliation of meeting a restroom when one wasn't available or accessible quickly.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
But it was part of the control.
Absolutely part of the control mechanism. The system of performance was so demanding, so suffocating, it forced the proudest nobles in Europe to just ignore their own basic physical dignity, their degradation, just to maintain their political closeness to the king. It's hard to launch a sophisticated political rebellion when you're simultaneously competing for the right to hand the king his hat and trying very hard not to step in human waste. ### B, affairs, wars, and the shift to piety.
Now, Louis the man, beneath the crown, he seemed to need constant reassurance that this projection of power was real. And that often translated into needing continuous novelty and admiration in his personal life, too.
Yes, his marriage to Maria Theresa of Spain was purely political. She pretty much retreated into a quiet life of, piety and comfort eating, frankly.
So his mistresses became important figures.
They became political and emotional barometers, absolutely. His first really notable mistress, Louise de la Vallière, was quiet, genuinely devoted, almost, cloyingly so.
But that wasn't quite right for him.
Apparently not. That devotion turned into emotional demands that Louis, the busy statesman king, found tedious. He wanted adoration, not interference.
So then came Dame de Montespan.
Who was the complete opposite. Famously sharp-tongued, incredibly intelligent, ambitious, bore him 7 children. She became so influential that foreign ambassadors basically recognized her as a de facto minister. She was a power center in her own right.
Quite scandalous.
Hugely. She represented the height of Louis's sort of earthly conquering ambition. But even Montespan eventually faded for him. Louis seemed to need that continuous conquest to validate his virility, his power. It was a cycle that didn't really end until his wife, Queen Maria Theresa, died in 1683.
And her death affected him.
It did. Despite their distant relationship, it genuinely seemed to impact him. And shortly after, around 1684, he secretly married Madame de Maintenon.
And she was very different again.
A major shift. She was a widow, highly educated, very focused on religion. She'd actually been the governess to his illegitimate children with Montespan.
Ah, interesting.
Maintenon became the anchor for the aging king. And under her influence, Louis became increasingly concerned with moral reform, with religious unity across France. This led to him becoming more isolated, turning away from the really lavish parties and military campaigns that had defined his youth, towards more austere governance.
But that shift towards piety, combined with his relentless political ambition, it had a devastating cost, didn't it?
Oh, enormous. Louis fought war after war against Spain, Holland, England, Austria, often fighting several at once. It essentially bankrupted the nation, drained its manpower. The War of the Spanish Succession, for instance, dragged on for 13 years, from 1701 to 1714. Utterly ruinous.
And internally, too, the political trauma he inflicted was immense.
Yes, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, driven by this desire for Catholic unity, supposedly influenced by Maintenon. It was a catastrophe.
What happened exactly?
Hundreds of thousands of French Protestants, the Huguenots, were forced to choose: convert to Catholicism, flee the country, or face horrific persecution, imprisonment, torture, even death.
It's a staggering self-inflicted wound for France.
Absolutely. It tore families apart, caused this immense brain drain. Huguenot artisans, merchants, skilled soldiers fled to rival nations like England, Prussia, Holland, taking their skills, their capital, their knowledge with them. Louis got his religious uniformity, but he decimated the national wealth and strength in the process.
And the physical expression of all this failure, this strain, it really hit home during the winter of 1709.
Ah, yes. One of the coldest winters in European history. We have reports saying wine froze solid in goblets inside heated homes, ink froze in inkwells.
Wow.
The general population, already reeling from war debts and taxes, faced mass starvation. There were riots over bread scarcity right in Paris.
And here's the core dissonance of the whole system, isn't it, amidst this national catastrophe?
The king's elaborate routine just continued, unchanged. His apartments were heated, his meals remained rich and plentiful, his elaborate court dress was maintained. The performance could not falter, not even for mass starvation.
It really cemented Versailles as this political and psychological prison,
Yeah.
this gilded cage that ensured the suffering of the state could never truly penetrate the king's insulated reality.
Precisely. Hashtag she, the body's betrayal, and the final performance. Which brings us to this moment of profound, almost cosmic irony. The elaborate, crushing fiction that Louis had built his entire reign on finally began to fail, not because of a rebellion, not a foreign invasion, but because of the decay of the Sun King's own mortal body.
And this is where it gets really interesting, and frankly, medically quite horrific.
Mm-hmm.
Louis was known to be unusually vain about his appearance. His teeth, apparently quite white initially, started decaying badly in the 1680s, and the physicians recommended immediate extraction.
Which in the 17th century meant... well, it meant being held down firmly while crude pliers were used to wrench the teeth out. No anesthetic, nothing.
Not imaginable.
Louis, the stoic king, endured it. But the damage was done. The decay didn't stop. It metastasized. An abscess formed in his jaw, causing this immense visible swelling that made his face permanently lopsided.
And the infection got even worse.
Much worse. It became so severe that it actually created a fistula, a hole between his mouth and his nasal cavity.
Oh, God.
So imagine the ultimate humiliation for the world's most powerful man. During state dinners, during ceremonies, food and drink would sometimes literally emerge from his nose.
No.
Yes. It forced him to devise these incredibly elaborate dining rituals, specific seating arrangements, anything to conceal this appalling bodily failure from the court.
That's grotesque. What did the doctors do?
Well, seeing the King of France struggling with this persistent, foul-smelling infection, they proposed a radical, utterly medieval intervention in January 1685.
Was it?
They strapped him to a table, immobilized him completely, and then attempted to cauterize and close the cavity using a red-hot iron pressed directly against the exposed bone and tissue in his upper jaw.
Red hot iron. No. No anesthesia.
No anesthesia. Pure agonizing torture. You have to picture the most powerful man in Europe screaming in pain while his surgeons attempt this brutal, desperate procedure.
Did it work?
It failed. Completely. Worse than failed, it left him with horrific scar tissue that pulled his mouth into this prominent, painful grimace. It made speaking difficult, eating became a nightmare. Yet every single day, the performance had to continue.
He still had to rule.
He still had to meet diplomats, receive petitioners, conduct all the court functions, all while battling unimaginable chronic pain and the simple struggle to articulate clearly.
And the physical problems just kept piling up after that.
They compounded rapidly. Gout, that incredibly painful form of arthritis, ravaged his hands and feet, made writing, even walking, agonizing acts of sheer will. Fluid started collecting in his legs, edema causing them to swell so severely that his silk stockings had to be carefully cut off each night just to relieve the pressure and prevent ulceration.
And his digestion.
His stomach was constantly upset, likely from the incredibly rich, heavy food required by his formal dining schedule, maybe also the stress and the constant pain.
So the fiction had to be maintained at this enormous cost. How did he hide it all?
Pure artifice. Thick layers of makeup white powder, red rouge, were applied daily to hide the deathly pallor and the lopsidedness of his face from the abscess and the surgery. His tailor was constantly redesigning his elaborate clothes to accommodate his changing body shape, but always maintaining that required silhouette of a magnificent, powerful monarch.
But the one thing, as we mentioned right at the start, the one thing that couldn't be masked.
The odor. As the infections worsened, as his bodily functions began to fail, this sweet, sick, unavoidable smell followed him everywhere. Courtiers learned the subtle art of breathing through their mouths, or keeping those perfumed handkerchiefs pressed constantly to their faces. It was this unspoken acknowledgement of the king's decomposition.
So the very etiquette of Versailles, designed to worship him.
Now serves solely to manage their collective revulsion. It's incredibly bleak.
And his personal life mirrored this decline too. Terrible tragedies.
Just devastating blows. Between 1711 and 1712, in a matter of months, Louis buried his son, the Dauphin, then his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, and then his great-grandson, the Duke of Brittany. 3 generations of his direct line just wiped out by illness.
Leaving only.
All that remained was a sickly 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XV, to inherit this shattered legacy.
And then the final decline came quickly.
By August 1715, the end was clearly apparent. A black spot appeared on his leg, unmistakable gangrene. It spread rapidly, despite the physicians' increasingly frantic, torturous interventions. They were bleeding him constantly, applying caustic substances, trying to burn away the infected tissue, crude attempts at amputation.
But he kept up the performance.
Almost to the very last moment, he still insisted on maintaining the ceremonies, propped up in bed, receiving ambassadors, signing documents until he physically could not lift a pen.
Have his final words to his heir.
In his final written instructions to the 5-year-old Louis XV, you see this moment of staggering self-awareness, maybe, after a life of just relentless ambition. He wrote, "Do not imitate me in the taste I have had for building, nor in that which I have had for war." Quite an admission.
Wow. He died on September 1st, 1715. Reigned for 72 years, just shy of his 77th birthday.
And the sources all emphasize the performance of stoicism never ceased. He maintained his royal dignity, never complained, never cursed his fate, died as he lived, utterly alone at the center of a world constructed entirely around him.
His death, for the exhausted French nation, it was described as like lifting a heavy shadow.
He controlled his powerful elite by forcing them into that gilded cage where the only currency that mattered was performance and proximity. And in the end, that system consumed him just as much as it controlled them.
It provides a really perfect analytical bridge for us, actually. If the Sun King used spectacle and surveillance to control the powerful, how did the elite of Victorian society control the truly powerless? If the currency of Versailles was gold and proximity, the currency of Whitechapel, well, it was desperation and silence. Let's shift dramatically now to the absolute vulnerability of Victorian London. Okay, so we move from the immense centralized authority of Versailles to this murky, decentralized engine of exploitation operating in Victorian London. specifically Whitechapel, where women lived right on the absolute margins of society. And what's immediately clear is how deeply sex work was just embedded in legitimate commerce there.
Yeah, it really wasn't some hidden underground thing. It was a fundamental part of the financial ecosystem of the East End. The whole system was financially sustained by seemingly respectable landlords, shopkeepers, local business owners who would never, ever admit to benefiting publicly, of course.
And we see this really clearly with a figure like John McCarthy. He owned the infamous properties at Miller's Court, which is where Mary Kelly lived and died. He was questioned during the inquest, and he was surprisingly open about his business practices.
He was very pragmatic. McCarthy basically explained that his business was providing clean, affordable accommodation. And then he made this pointed statement. If he refused to rent to women of, quote, questionable reputation, unquote, then half his properties would just stand empty.
So he's admitting it.
So he's admitting his economic survival depended directly on the reliable income generated by sex work. This constant flow of rent money, often collected daily, made the system incredibly resilient no matter what society's public morals dictated.
And central to this whole environment were the public houses, the pubs, and those vast, glittering gin palaces.
Right, they were social hubs, definitely, places to get warm, meet people, but they were also prime recruitment centers for procurers and pimps and places of temporary escape.
Escape with a cost.
A brutal cost. The Gin Palace offered warmth, maybe a moment of oblivion from the raw horror of the tenements, but that escape created instant acute vulnerability. Intoxicated women were just easy targets for theft, for violence, for exploitation.
And the sources show how quickly society basically forfeited its protective duties. Once a woman was labeled dissolute. Take Martha Tabram, murdered in August 1888. She was seen drinking with some soldiers shortly before her death. And her murder was quickly dismissed by many officials and the press as just an unremarkable consequence of the dangerous lifestyle she had chosen.
That dismissal, that language, it illustrates this chilling societal abandonment.
Yeah.
By choosing, or more likely being forced into, that lifestyle, these women essentially forfeited their basic claim to police protection or any kind of societal care. They were pre-categorized as disposable. It's horrifying.
And we see the impossible choices poverty forced on them in the testimony of Ellen Holland. She was a friend of Mary Ann Nichols, one of the victims.
Ah, yes, that's heart-wrenching testimony. Ellen testified that Mary Ann had actually earned her lodging money for the night, just 4 pence. But instead of securing her bed, she chose to spend it on gin for temporary relief.
Why?
Well, that decision, choosing a fleeting moment of psychological numbness over secure shelter, it just reveals the devastating trade-offs imposed by sheer desperation. It was a choice between immediate physical safety for a few hours versus a brief escape from the crushing psychological weight of their reality.
It's an impossible choice.
Completely. And Ellen Holland, seeing this cycle again and again, she later lamented the psychological toll it took on those who tried to help. She said something like, "You get tired of trying to save people who don't seem to want saving." But it wasn't a lack of will on the victim's part. It was a system that ensured the only available escape route was also the path to utter vulnerability. Hashtag de-violence, stigma, and the silent acceptance.
And the violence these women faced, it often wasn't just random street crime. Sometimes it carried this deeply disturbing ideological justification, often hidden beneath the polite exterior of supposedly respectable Victorian men.
Yes, Annie Millwood provides terrifying evidence of this. She survived a really brutal knife attack back in February 1888 before the Maine Ripper murders.
What did she describe?
She described her attacker as initially behaving like a perfect gentleman, well-dressed, polite, courteous. But once they were alone, his demeanor shifted instantly, terrifyingly.
He didn't just attack her.
No, he preached at her while attacking her. He spoke of needing to cleanse the streets of filth like me, suggesting he was on some kind of moral or even divine mission.
That's chilling.
It implies that violence against these marginalized women wasn't always just simple criminal intent. It was often fueled by the dominant moral rhetoric of Victorian society itself, framing the attacks almost as a purification ritual rather than just a brutal crime.
The women became symbols.
Exactly. Symbolic targets for men acting out the deep moral anxieties and hypocrisies of the time. And this ideological basis for violence, coupled with their absolute economic vulnerability, it enforced this pervasive culture of silence.
We see that with Frances Coles, right? Murdered in 1891. She'd been treated for injuries multiple times in the years before her death.
6 times between 1888 and 1891. And almost every time, she told doctors or friends that she'd simply fallen down or had some kind of accident. She was terrified of naming her attackers.
Why? What would happen?
Her fear was entirely rational, based on the grim reality of her life. A friend testified that the women all understood the brutal calculation. Better to take the beating and hope for gentler treatment next time. Complaining about violence just made you seem like trouble.
And trouble was bad for business.
Trouble meant losing customers, losing your lodging, losing the incredibly tenuous grip you had on basic survival. Economic dependence forced the silent endurance of violence. There was no other choice.
And the normalization of all this misery in the streets was just shocking. Think about when the Carmen Charles Cross first discovered Marianne Nichols's body.
Right, his initial reaction.
He initially mistook her for just another poor soul who'd had too much drink and was sleeping it off on the pavement.
That reflexive assumption just shows how incredibly common it was to find women unconscious, ill, or deeply intoxicated in public spaces. The misery was just part of the everyday landscape. It wasn't remarkable.
And the second man, Robert Paul.
When Robert Paul, the second Carmen, arrived, his first instinct was reluctance to get involved at all, purely because of the intense social stigma attached to even being seen assisting women of that sort. That societal judgment created a moral and physical barrier to getting help, even when someone was clearly injured or, in this case, dead. #TAG the medical reality versus the official view.
Now, if we look closely at the medical documentation from the time, what's really fascinating is the stark evidence that these women were already, in a very real sense, dying slowly, long before any dramatic, violent encounter.
Yes, the autopsy reports compiled by the police surgeons, examiners like Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, they revealed the chronic, devastating physical toll of poverty, disease, and constant exploitation.
What did they find?
Dr. Brown's postmortem exams are like these heartbreaking clinical testimonies to systemic decay. Take Catherine Eddowes, for example. Her autopsy revealed extensive evidence of chronic kidney disease. Bright's disease, they called it then. Severe liver damage, consistent with prolonged, heavy alcohol consumption, likely self-medication. Clear signs of chronic malnutrition, and old defensive scarring across her body from previous undocumented attacks.
So she was already profoundly unwell.
Profoundly. And Marianne Nichols showed similar signs of long-term system failure. Advanced syphilis, extensive tooth loss, probably linked to both malnutrition and disease, and a chronic respiratory infection, quite possibly tuberculosis.
So the murders were just the final act.
Essentially, yes. Dr. Brown noted that these women were dying by degrees long before they encountered violent death. The gruesome, spectacular nature of the murders finally drew public attention, but it obscured the slow, grinding physical deterioration that defined their daily existence. A deterioration caused directly by extreme poverty, lack of sanitation, poor nutrition, and an utter absence of meaningful medical care.
And this grim clinical reality stood in really stark contrast to the official institutional categorization of the victims, didn't it?
Oh, completely. Inspector John Spratling's initial police report on Marianne Nichols is a perfect example of this official dismissal.
What did it say?
He categorized her simply as a woman of dissolute character and noted specifically, almost clinically, that she had no known relatives or persons of respectability to notify.
Dehumanizing language.
The institutional language was designed, whether consciously or not, to minimize the tragedy, dehumanize the victim, and frankly, justify allocating minimal investigative resources. It was a bureaucratic mechanism for reinforcing the societal judgment already placed upon them. Nothing to see here, move along.
But there was a counter view, thankfully, a minority view that eventually forced more serious police attention.
Yes, thankfully. Inspector Frederick Aberline, who ended up coordinating the main Ripper investigation, he articulated this more empathetic, more structural perspective.
What was his take?
Aberline really pushed back against that institutional norm. He argued quite pointedly, these women are not criminals in any meaningful sense. They are casualties of social conditions that leave them few alternatives for survival.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
It was critical because it shifted the blame, or at least the focus, from supposed individual moral failing towards the larger societal structure. And that forced law enforcement eventually to treat these cases with the gravity they deserved, regardless of the victim's social status or perceived character.
And this call for looking at the structures, the social responsibility, it was echoed by social reformers at the time too, wasn't it? Like William Booth of the Salvation Army.
Absolutely. Booth directly challenged the established narrative of individual moral failing, the idea that these women were just inherently bad.
What did he argue?
Booth insisted they weren't simply morally depraved. They were, in his words, trapped by circumstances beyond their individual control. Things like overwhelming poverty, family breakdown, abuse, and critically, a complete lack of legitimate employment alternatives that actually paid a living wage for women.
And his work showed results.
His organization's work, offering shelter, food, support, and alternative training, showed that change was possible. It demonstrated quite effectively that providing resources could break the cycle, proving the root cause was often poverty and lack of opportunity, not innate bad character.
And the sources also detail something even darker, an international dimension to this engine of exploitation, these trafficking networks.
Yes, Catherine Bramwell Booth, William's daughter-in-law, did crucial work documenting how women weren't just exploited locally in London, but globally.
How did these networks operate?
They were ruthless and frighteningly well organized. Women, often young and deeply desperate, maybe escaping poverty or abuse at home, would be lured with these irresistible promises of legitimate, respectable work overseas, high-paying jobs as domestic servants, for example.
So they thought they were getting a better life.
Exactly. They'd be transported, often across the Channel, say from England to Brussels or Paris, but once they arrived, the trap was sprung.
What happened then?
They'd find themselves forced into brothels, maybe told the promised job fell through, and immediately find themselves indebted to their traffickers for the cost of their travel, their clothes, their accommodation. The debt load was deliberately made impossible to repay.
And they were trapped.
Completely trapped. Often by acute language barriers in a foreign city, totally isolated, passports confiscated, unable to seek help, threatened with violence. The sophisticated nature of these networks ensured that the basic, brutal mathematics of desperation meeting desire could transcend national borders.
So the system functioned perfectly to exploit them.
Perfectly, exploiting legal loopholes, geographical distance, everything to maximize profit from human vulnerability. It really demonstrates that the structural decay of society wasn't just a local problem, it was a global commercial commodity.
So we've explored these two incredible extremes of historical power and powerlessness. In Louis XIV Forfeit's final months, we saw the absolute isolation that was required by absolute power. And then in the Women of Whitechapel, we saw the absolute vulnerability enforced by having zero power. But if we connect this now, look at the bigger picture, both systems seem to share this terrible destructive requirement.
They absolutely do. It's the requirement for a continuous punishing performance.
Explain that.
Well, the French monarchy demanded Louis perform physical perfection, divine right, even if it meant literally hiding a jaw rotting from infection with powder, rouge, and an expensive wig. And Victorian morality, on the other hand, demanded invisibility, supposed cleanliness, and absolute silence from the marginalized women, so that respectable society could maintain the comforting illusion that their streets, their homes, their men were morally clean. Both performances were designed solely to sustain a grand protective illusion.
And the consequence of maintaining those illusions was profound decay, both physical and moral.
Exactly. Louis's body rotted because the system demanded he maintain the rich diet, the elaborate etiquette, the stoicism required of a godlike king, regardless of the agonizing pain. It wouldn't allow him to be merely human and sick.
And the London women.
Similarly, their bodies rotted slowly from syphilis, malnutrition, constant low-level violence, because the system demanded their perpetual availability and eventual disposal. They provided this necessary channel for the desires of respectable men without ever challenging the moral authority or the comfortable domesticity of the middle and upper classes who ultimately sustained the whole structure. The decay was systemic in both cases.
And the sources really suggest that the core mathematics of this kind of exploitation, it never truly ended, did it? It just sort of transformed its costume over time.
I think that's right. That elaborate performance of moral outrage you see in Victorian society, where they publicly deplored prostitution while simultaneously ensuring its economic viability through things like McCarthy's rentals, it's a perfect historical echo that resonates even today.
How so?
That chilling dynamic feels very familiar. It's still often desperation on one side, desire on the other, bridged entirely by profit and exploitation. The gaslit streets might have given way to sophisticated international trafficking routes or anonymous internet platforms, maybe deceptive fronts like some massage parlors, but the fundamental relationship between the consumer, the intermediary profiting, and the person being exploited, it remains tragically identical in structure.
So the true horror of both these systems, whether they're operating at the absolute zenith of wealth like Versailles or in the darkest depths of poverty like Whitechapel,
lies in how thoroughly the structure itself functioned to eliminate the human element, to ensure that the participants, whether they were the king on his throne or the commoner on the street, were ultimately used and discarded without ever fundamentally challenging the moral or political authority of the system that created them and benefited from their performance or their silence. Hashtag outtag outro.
We've come to the end of our deep dive into these two really unique forms of human suffering, both driven by this relentless pressure of systemic performance. Whether that suffering was hidden behind the glittering gold curtain of Versailles or submerged beneath the literal fog of Whitechapel, the ultimate price of demanding perfection or of willfully ignoring suffering is decay. Physical, moral, and political decay.
Louis XIV's enduring legacy is often encapsulated in that famous defining phrase, L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. But based on the evidence we've looked at today, maybe we should ask, which environment ultimately provides the more honest, the more enduring image of a state's true fundamental condition? Is it the Sun King rotting on his throne, surrounded by courtiers who literally dared not breathe the air around him? Or is it the women dying slowly, bit by bit, from poverty and disease in the streets, ignored by the very society that consumes them?
That's a powerful final thought, something to definitely mull over as you consider where those structures of performance and silence and maybe moral hypocrisy still exist, perhaps transformed in our own world today.